April 16, 2016, a Saturday morning on a quiet Quebec highway, a motorcycle, a blue and grey SUV, pulling alongside it, between 10 and 15 shots, fired, then silence. The man on that motorcycle had once stood inside an Olympic ring in front of an entire country. He went to Atlanta. He came home a hero. He was arrested at his own parade. And 20 years after that, someone wearing the same patch he wore tried to finish the job on a road outside La Chute, Quebec. His name was Phil Boudreault. The boxing world called him the Sudbury sensation. The Hells Angels called him crazy. And the people who shot him never called themselves anything at all. The kid from Sudbury, before the patch, before the nickname, before the Olympic ring. There was just a kid growing up in Sudbury, Ontario, with no father, a working-class mother, and a mining city that didn't promise much to children who started with nothing. Phil Boudreault was born on January 23, 1975. His father abandoned the family while Phil was still an infant. Not absent in the way some fathers are absent, not distant, not unreliable, not someone who showed up occasionally and left again. Gone. From the beginning. His mother raised him alone in one of Northern Ontario's oldest industrial cities, a place built on nickel and hard labor, where the landscape was dark soil and stripped rock, and the smell of the smelters sat on the horizon like permanent weather. The population was working class in the specific way that northern resource towns are working class, not struggling towards something better, but settled into what was, generation after generation, in the mines and the mills and the diners and the bars. It was not the kind of city that produced Olympians. Boxing changed that. When Boudreault found his way to Gord Apolloni's Top Glove Academy in Sudbury, something clicked that had never clicked before. Apolloni would go on to coach Canada's national boxing team through most of the 1990s, working with athletes from across the country at the highest levels of international amateur competition. He had seen talent before. He knew what it looked like and what it didn't. He later described the young Boudreault in terms that didn't leave room for ambiguity. He was a role model from day one, Apolloni said. Not just for his ability, but for the way he carried himself in the gym, the way he approached the work, the way he raised the standard of everyone around him simply by refusing to accept anything less. He brought everyone else up to his level. He didn't think about his opponent. He just wanted to beat him. That distinction matters more than it might sound. There is a difference between a fighter who trains to survive and a fighter who trains to destroy. Between someone who enters the ring hoping not to get hurt badly and someone who enters it with the goal of ending the contest on their terms, Boudreault was the second kind, completely and consistently. It showed in the gym, in sparring sessions, in the way he moved, and the way he absorbed punishment and came forward anyway. He was relentless, in a way that coaches will tell you cannot be manufactured. Some fighters flinch when they get hit. Some fighters slow when they get hurt. Phil Boudreault treated getting hit like a reminder to hit back harder. He treated getting hurt like information about where the other person's guard was open. Apolloni, who had seen fighters from across the country come through Top Glove, said he never had another athlete quite like him. That is not a small statement from a man who coached the national team for the better part of a decade. Phil trained through his teens and into his early 20s, competing at the national level, developing the craft that would eventually carry him to the Pan American Games in Argentina, where he represented Canada and further sharpened the technical edge that distinguished him from the other elite fighters he competed against. He was a welterweight, clean and orthodox in his stance, with a combination of hand speed and punching power that the amateur system had refined into something that genuinely threatened opponents at the international level, the kind of prospect coaches wait careers to find. All of that was true, every word of it. And simultaneously, while all of it was true, Phil Boudreault was already a member of Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. He had been for years. Two worlds, one man, neither one of them willing to yield to the other. Not yet, not ever, if he could help it. Satan's Choice and the men he chose to follow. Satan's Choice was not a minor club with a colorful name and a limited history. For decades, it was the dominant outlaw motorcycle organization in Ontario, founded in Oshawa in 1965, eventually spreading to dozens of chapters across Canada and into the United States and Finland. with a membership that at its peak numbered in the hundreds across multiple provinces. In the world of 1%er motorcycle clubs, which has its own hierarchies and its own definitions of power and respect, Satan's Choice occupied a position that very few Canadian clubs have ever held. At the top of that world, in the years Phil Boudreault was coming up, stood two men whose names carried weight across every chapter and every allied organization in the country. Bernie Guindon was the national president. He had been building Satan's Choice since nearly its founding, and he had built it into the second largest outlaw motorcycle organization in the world at the club's peak. He was the kind of leader that organizations produce once, if they are lucky, someone who embodied the club's values so completely that his personal reputation and the club's reputation became inseparable. When Guindon was imprisoned in the late 1970s and the club fractured in the so-called Big Split, losing chapters to the outlaws and watching its national structure collapse, it was only when he returned that the remaining chapters stabilized. His influence was not transferable. It was his, specifically, and every serious person in the 1%er world understood that. Beside him, year after year, was Lorne Campbell. Born in Whitby, Ontario, in September 1948, Campbell had joined Satan's Choice in 1965 at 17 years old. Over the next 3.5 decades, he built a reputation for absolute reliability and complete willingness that made him indispensable. He served as chapter president in Oshawa for 12 years, then later president of the Hells Angels Sudbury chapter after the patchover. He had been convicted multiple times, perjury, assault, multiple drug conspiracies going back to 1983, and had served time, come out, returned, and continued. His reputation had been built through decades of consistent behavior in circumstances that tested consistency. He was, in the language of the 1%er world, solid in the deepest sense of that word. Phil Boudreault had grown up hearing those names. He would later say of Campbell and Guindon in an interview, "They don't make men like what they used to. I wish everybody was like that." Signed. Read that sentence slowly. He wasn't describing admiration for athletes, or admiration for business success, or admiration for any of the qualities that the mainstream world recognizes as worth admiring. He was describing men who stood by a code consistently, regardless of the cost. Men who didn't sway. Men who, when they gave their word, kept it, and when they demanded loyalty, returned it. For a fatherless kid from a working-class mining city, the appeal of that wasn't complicated or mysterious. These were men who stayed, who didn't leave, who built something and stood by it and expected the people around them to do the same. That held a power that the boxing gym, as meaningful as it was, couldn't fully replicate. The outlaw motorcycle club world in Ontario in the 1990s was not, from the outside, easy to understand. It had its own protocols, its own definitions of honor and respect, its own understanding of what a man owed to the people around him and what they owed back. It operated by a code that the mainstream world considered criminal because it was criminal, but that to the people inside it felt like something the mainstream world had lost: consistency, accountability, the expectation that when you gave your word, you kept it, and that failing to keep it had real, immediate, and non-negotiable consequences. Whether that code was just, whether the violence it normalized was defensible, whether the organizations it sustained did more harm than good to the communities around them, those are different questions. What it offered to a fatherless kid from Sudbury was something immediate and real, a structure in which men who stayed were respected and men who didn't were not. Phil Boudreault chose it with his eyes open. He had grown up adjacent to it. He understood what it was. So he did both. He joined Satan's Choice. He kept the membership hidden from the boxing establishment because he understood the consequence. If it came out, they could have pulled him from the national team, from Atlanta, from the entire Olympic project he had spent years building toward. He knew the risk. He accepted it. He kept the membership anyway, because losing one identity was not an option he was willing to consider. His biker name was Crazy. On his right fist, he tattooed the word hard in capital letters. On his left, the word core. 2 fists, 2 words, 1 philosophy. He carried that philosophy to Atlanta in the summer of 1996. Atlanta, 1996. The 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia. Phil Boudreault was 20 years old. Baby-faced on national television, talking to a CBC journalist after an upset win in his opening bout, with the kind of nervous sincerity that made people in living rooms across the country genuinely root for him. He was from Sudbury. He was from a single mother and an absent father and a northern Ontario mining city that hadn't sent anyone to the Olympic Games before him and hasn't since. Think about what it takes to get to the Olympic Games as a boxer from a small Canadian city in the mid-1990s. There is no professional development pipeline pointing you there. There is no well-funded national program covering your travel and training costs from childhood. There is no automatic recognition from the broader sports world that boxing in Northern Ontario is a pathway to anything. You get there through a combination of natural ability, extraordinary discipline, access to the right coach, and enough victories at increasingly high levels of competition that the selection committee has no choice but to put your name on the roster. You get there by being demonstrably, undeniably better than the other people competing for the same spot. Phil Boudreault got there all of those ways simultaneously. He had gotten to Atlanta through years of work that the television audience couldn't fully see. Early mornings at Top Glove Academy, training sessions that went until he had nothing left, and then kept going. Pan American Games in Argentina, where he had learned and sharpened. Regional competitions, where he had built the record and the reputation that made national selection not only possible, but inevitable. The Olympic stage was not a surprise. It was the destination he had been working toward for years. He had earned it in the most unambiguous sense of that word. One more win in Atlanta would have put him within reach of a medal. Instead, he ran into Russian Eduard Zakharov in the round of 16. The fight went the full distance. Both men competed hard across every round. The decision went to Zakharov by the narrowest of margins. Apolloni, years later, said Boudreault had been robbed. Ringside observers agreed with that assessment. The international amateur boxing scoring system, particularly in the mid-1990s, operated with a level of opacity that disadvantaged fighters from outside the sport's traditional power structures. Soviet and post-Soviet fighters had the institutional weight of decades of investment behind them. A welterweight from Sudbury, however capable, was fighting uphill on multiple fronts simultaneously. Whether it was a robbery or simply a close decision that went the wrong way, the result was unchanged. Phil Boudreault left Atlanta without a medal. He had come within one fight of the podium and fallen short of it. But he left as something, a figure, a story. The kid from Sudbury who had stood in the Olympic ring in front of the country and come within a razor-thin margin of Olympic bronze. That is not nothing. That is, for many athletes, the defining achievement of a lifetime. Sudbury threw him a parade. The city organized a formal civic celebration. Crowds lined the streets of downtown. Floats rolled through the city center. People who had watched him on national television, people who had never set foot in a boxing gym, who had no particular connection to the sport, came out to welcome the young man home, to share in a moment of civic pride that smaller cities rarely get to feel in quite that way. He had carried Sudbury onto a world stage and almost delivered. That was enough. It was more than enough. The city was celebrating one of its own, and the celebration was real. Somewhere in the middle of that parade, police officers moved through the crowd toward Boudreault with an outstanding warrant in hand. He was arrested before the celebration was even over. The triumph and the consequence arrived at exactly the same time, not one and then the other, sequentially, as a lesson about choices. At the same time, the crowd still roaring around him, the floats still moving, the cheering still carrying across the city, and the handcuffs coming out while all of it was still happening. That moment, more than any fight he ever had in any ring, more than any biker meeting he ever attended, more than any sentence he ever served, said everything there was to say about who Phil Boudreault was. He held both worlds in his hands. He had held them simultaneously for years. He had managed the balance through discipline, through compartmentalization, through the force of will that makes elite athletes and serious criminals both function at the level they function at. And even at the moment of his greatest public triumph, the balance was visible. The boxer and the biker, side by side, impossible to separate. He didn't flinch at either one. That was the thing. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look ashamed. He had known, on some level, that this was always how it was going to look eventually. The two things arriving together. He had accepted that, and done both anyway. The patch over. For 3 years after Atlanta, Boudreault kept moving, training, competing at regional levels, building a reputation in the biker world that was starting to extend beyond Sudbury and beyond Satan's Choice itself. He was present in both worlds. He was active in both worlds. And he was watching what was happening in Quebec with the kind of attention he gave everything that mattered. The Quebec biker war had been running since 1994. The Hells Angels, fighting to establish total and unchallenged dominance over Quebec's drug distribution network, had gone to war against the rock machine and every independent operator who refused to fall in line. The scale of that conflict is worth pausing on because it sits in the background of everything that happens later. 162 people killed between 1994 and 2002, 84 bombings, 130 arsons. The conflict ran for 8 years and reshaped organized crime in Canada permanently. Among the dead was Daniel Desroches, 11 years old, killed by shrapnel from a car bomb planted in a Montreal parking lot in August 1995. He was walking back from a friend's house. He died 4 days after the explosion. His death produced a public outcry that put pressure on the government to create new organized crime legislation, which eventually came in the form of Bill C-95 inches 1997, introducing gangsterism charges into the criminal code specifically to address what was happening in Quebec. The Hells Angels won that war. By the turn of the millennium, they were the unchallenged power in Quebec's underworld, the dominant force in drug distribution from Montreal to the regions, with the financial infrastructure, the political connections, and the reputation that came with 8 years of violent victory. And they were expanding into Ontario. The 29th of December 2000, a ceremony at the Hells Angels Mother Chapter in Sorel-Tracy, a small city just south of Montreal. Satan's Choice, the Vagabonds, the Lobos, the Last Chance, the Paradise Riders, and significant factions of the Loners crossed the floor simultaneously in what became one of the most significant single events in the history of Canadian organized crime. Hundreds of Ontario bikers, in a single stroke, stopped wearing the patches they had built their identities around and became Hells Angels. Overnight, the organization that had won Quebec's biker war became the dominant outlaw motorcycle force in Ontario as well. One police officer, speaking to journalist Jerry Langton about the mass ceremony in Sorel, later said, "They were truly scraping the bottom of the barrel. They were trading patch for patch, the legendary Hells Angel patch, for some of the lowest of the low." That assessment, however harsh, reflected a real tension. The Angels were buying scale in Ontario, converting existing clubs wholesale rather than building organic chapters from scratch. The quality control varied. Boudreault followed the men he trusted. That was not a complicated decision for him. In his world, loyalty was the framework within which everything else operated. You identified the right people, the ones who stood by their word, who didn't sway, who maintained the code under pressure, and you went where they went. Campbell was going. The men Boudreault had built his adult identity alongside were going. He went. Inside the new Hells Angels Sudbury chapter, the man appointed chapter president was Lorne Campbell, the man Boudreault had grown up hearing about, the man whose name had meant something in this world before Boudreault was old enough to understand what 1%ers were. The relationship they built was not simply professional, it was something closer to what Boudreault had never had at home. He called Campbell Dad. He said of him, "I always felt that he was me, just an older version of me." Campbell, from his side, described Boudreault with the precision of someone who had assessed a great many men and knew what he was looking at. He doesn't back down from anybody. People will make money off him and his reputation without him even knowing. That sentence is the map of everything that comes next. Amsterdam and the patch. Earning full patch membership in the Hells Angels takes time. That is by design. The process involves background assessment, extended probationary periods, typically ranging from months to years, sustained performance during that period, and a formal vote by the existing membership of a chapter before a prospect can be elevated to full patch status. The organization is deliberate about who it admits at the highest level, because the patch is the brand, and the brand's value depends on the people who carry it. Most men who try never make it. Most men who make it take the long road. Phil Boudreault skipped most of it. In May 2002, Boudreault traveled to Europe with Lorne Campbell on a tour of Hells Angels chapters across the continent. The Angels maintain a significant international presence chapters across Western Europe, with particularly strong formations in the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, and the United Kingdom. Senior Canadian members making relationship visits to those chapters was part of the organizational fabric, a way of maintaining the international connections that gave the club its global character. When they arrived at the Amsterdam clubhouse, the Dutch chapter's reaction to the former Olympian was immediate and unanimous. His physical presence, the build, the posture, the way he occupied space that fighters develop from years in the gym, created an impression that prospect status could not account for. His boxing reputation had preceded him across the Atlantic. The Amsterdam members had opinions about who this man was before he walked through the door, and those opinions were formed not from the biker world, but from the sport that had put him on national television 6 years earlier. They were not prepared to treat him as a prospect. They had been offering him free drinks at the clubhouse bar, a privilege normally reserved for full patch members, and when the discrepancy between his treatment and his formal status was raised, they were not interested in the procedural arguments. He was Phil Boudreault. He was an Olympian. He had the hands, the history, and the endorsement of Lorne Campbell standing beside him. That was sufficient. Campbell agreed on the spot. In what he would later describe as a cramped Amsterdam motel room, not a formal ceremony, not a chapter meeting with protocols and rituals, just a motel room in the Netherlands. Late in the evening, Lorne Campbell handed Phil Boudreault a vest bearing the full Hells Angels Death's head patch. According to Campbell, Boudreault was genuinely shocked. He had traveled to Europe as a prospect. He came home a full member. No extended probation, no formal chapter vote, a motel room in Amsterdam and a vest. In its way, that Amsterdam evening was the closest parallel in Boudreaux's criminal life to the Atlanta Olympics. A moment when a room full of people looked at him and recognized something that formal processes and procedures had not yet accounted for, and decided to skip the process. The difference was what the recognition meant and what it cost. The boxing career continued for a few more years. He returned to professional competition in 2008, winning his first fight at Casino Rama in Aurelia against Tabor Brosh by split decision in January, then adding 2 more wins across the year. He finished his professional record at 5 wins and 1 loss before a torn Achilles tendon in March 2009, sustained in the 5th round against Justin Fountain at a fight where he was caught and went down hard, ended the athletic chapter of his life permanently. The Achilles pulled away from the bone. Surgery and recovery followed, but the career was over. The other chapter had been locked in for years. Violence, the law, and the long-term offender designation. The violence Phil Boudreault carried through his years inside the Hells Angels was not casual or incidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and increasingly costly, both to the people on the receiving end of it and, over time, to him. In 2004, he attacked a father and son in a bar in Valley East, a community northeast of Sudbury. He left the father with a jaw broken in 3 places. This was not an ordinary bar fight. This was a man with Olympic-level combat training and 30-plus years of developing the specific capability to hurt people efficiently, applying that capability to a civilian context. The results reflected the capability. The Crown did not treat it as a standard assault. They pursued a dangerous offender designation, one of the most serious legal classifications available under Canadian law, designed for individuals whose pattern of violent behavior represents a persistent risk that cannot be managed through any fixed-term sentence. A dangerous offender designation carries with it an indefinite sentence. The court continues to hold you until it is satisfied, through periodic review, that you no longer represent an unacceptable threat. It is the legal system's most explicit acknowledgement that some individuals cannot be expected to stop. Boudreault narrowly avoided it. Through legal proceedings and negotiation, he accepted 3 years in custody and long-term offender status, a designation that requires ongoing supervision after release, with conditions attached. Among those conditions upon release was an explicit order: sever all ties with criminal organizations. He didn't. This bears dwelling on for a moment. The court had assessed him as someone whose violence was connected to his criminal associations, and imposed a legal requirement that he remove himself from those associations. He left custody and went back, not tentatively or partially, or with some reasonable accommodation of the court's requirements. He went back fully. He returned to the club. He returned to the relationships. He returned to the chapter structure. And he continued to rise inside it. There is something clarifying about that choice if you are trying to understand who Phil Boudreault was. It was not a failure of judgment or an act of desperation. It was a statement of identity. The club was not a thing he did alongside a life. It was the life. Removing it was not an adjustment. It was an erasure of the self he had built. In prison, Boudreault did not disappear. He operated. There is documented evidence from the years he spent inside that he maintained his organizational standing from behind bars, a not uncommon feature of leadership-level members of the Hells Angels, who have historically managed to sustain club business and influence through networks of associates, visitors, and communication channels that prisons were not always equipped to fully monitor or disrupt. The code traveled with him into custody and came back out with him when he left. He was also not operating in a vacuum from the perspective of surveillance. His name appeared repeatedly in police intelligence files across the years. His associations were documented. His movements were monitored at various points. In July 2018, it emerged that Christopher Casola, a tax officer with the Canada Revenue Agency, who was simultaneously a member of the Bacchus Motorcycle Club, had accessed Boudreaux's private tax records in November and December of 2014. A government employee using official federal access pulling the financial records of a senior Hells Angels member, Casola was identified and charged. But the fact that it happened at all illustrated something about the depth of entanglement between criminal organizations and the institutions that were nominally working against them. Through all of it, the convictions, the designations, the conditions, the surveillance, Boudreault kept rising inside the organization, which brings us to Operation SharQc and to the power vacuum that changed everything. Operation SharQc and the vacuum. The 15th of April, 2009, Quebec Provincial Police and the RCMP struck simultaneously across the province in what remains the largest single law enforcement action ever carried out against the Hells Angels in Canadian history. 156 people arrested in a single morning. Members and associates swept up from Sherbrooke to Quebec City to Montreal's South Shore to the Laurentians. Charges of gangsterism, drug trafficking, conspiracy, and in some cases, murder. The organizational leadership that had consolidated its power after winning the Biker War, that had built an integrated drug distribution operation stretching across the entire province, that had turned the Hells Angels into the dominant criminal force in Quebec for the better part of a decade, arrested, placed in cells, facing trials that investigators expected to take years to complete. The scale was staggering. In one operation, the Quebec Hells Angels went from unchallenged provincial power to a headless organization scrambling to maintain order from inside detention facilities. The territory they controlled didn't disappear because the men who ran it were arrested. The drug routes didn't close, the revenue streams didn't stop. The infrastructure existed whether or not the people at the top of it were free. But management, the decisions about where the product moved, who handled disputes, who received what percentage, how problems were resolved that required people who were available. And after the 15th of April, 2009, most of the people at the top of that structure in Quebec were not available. That created an opening. The Ontario Nomads moved through it. The Nomads chapter is not an ordinary chapter of the Hells Angels. In the club's internal hierarchy, a Nomads chapter has no fixed territorial limits. It is not bound to a specific city or region the way a standard chapter is. It draws its membership from among the most capable and fully vetted individuals the organization has available in a given area. It answers, in terms of operational scope, to the club's national and international leadership rather than to any regional structure. It is, in the blunt terms, the organization uses internally, the elite formation, and its Ontario iteration, based in Ottawa, had the membership to reflect that designation. Phil Boudreault was that chapter's vice president. His president was Martin Bonatchez. Together, in the years following the SharQc arrests, they moved into Quebec and began operating in territory that the imprisoned Quebec members fully expected to reclaim the moment their legal situations resolved. It was a reasonable expectation from their perspective. They had built that territory, they had won it through violence and held it through organization. The Ontario nomads had moved in during the emergency created by the arrests. That was, from the Quebec members' point of view, a temporary arrangement at best and an opportunistic encroachment at worst. The scale of the SharQc prosecution became its undoing. The Crown had assembled a case involving 156 accused across multiple counts of gangsterism, drug trafficking, and murder charges that spanned an 8-year period and required the coordination of an enormous quantity of evidence, expert witnesses, and legal argument. The sheer logistical complexity of managing that volume of material through the Quebec court system created delays that accumulated month after month after month. Defense lawyers filed motion after motion. Scheduling conflicts arose and compounded. Courtrooms that were available could not accommodate the number of accused simultaneously. The machinery of justice, designed for individual prosecutions or small group trials, groaned under the weight of what the Crown was attempting. The legal resolution of SharQc was not what anyone expected. By October 2015, after 6 years of complex proceedings, a Quebec court stayed all remaining charges against the Hells Angels members still awaiting trial. The estimated trial duration had exceeded 30 months, violating the constitutional right to timely justice established by the Supreme Court of Canada's Jordan decision. Men who had been arrested in 2009 walked free, not acquitted, not convicted, released on the basis that the prosecution had taken too long, that the complexity of the case had produced a constitutional violation, and that the charges could not proceed. The SharQc members were out, and they wanted their territory back. November 2015, and the line that was drawn. When the Quebec Hells Angels began returning from SharQc in 2015, they returned to a province where the Ontario nomads had been operating for the better part of 6 years. The drug routes the nomads had developed, the relationships they had built with distributors and street-level crews across the province, the revenue streams they had established and maintained while the Quebec chapters were occupied with the legal consequences of the mass arrest. From the Ontario nomads' perspective, they had provided a service during a crisis. They had maintained operations, kept the infrastructure functional, and done so at some risk to themselves during a period when Quebec law enforcement was actively focused on the organization. They had not walked away. They had stayed and worked. From the Sherbrooke chapter's perspective, that framing was irrelevant. Sherbrooke had been one of the most powerful chapters in the province before SharQc. It had built its territory through decades of work and through violence during the Biker War. The Ontario nomads operating in that territory during the vacuum years was not a service, it was an intrusion. And now that the arrested members were free, the expectation was simple and non-negotiable. You leave, you return what was ours, you go back to Ontario. The Ontario nomads showed no intention of leaving. The 19th of November 2015 is Quebec City, a confrontation between members of the Ontario nomads and the Sherbrooke chapter that made the territorial dispute explicit in a way that left no room for ambiguity. The message from Sherbrooke was direct: we are not leaving. Organized crime expert and author André Cédillo later observed, the Hells Angels do not hesitate to take out their weapons to protect their territories. Both sides believed this territory was theirs. One side had the history of bleeding to build it. The other had the operation built on top of it. And in the criminal world, history and current operations are two different arguments, and neither one automatically prevails over the other. Phil Boudreault was the vice president of the chapter that had built the operation. He was the number 2 man in an Ontario organization that had moved into Quebec and was refusing to move out. His face was known. His position was known. His chapter's posture was known. 5 months later, someone on a Quebec highway demonstrated what the Sherbrooke chapter was prepared to do about it. Lachute, April 16th, 2016. We are back where we started, the 16th of April, 2016. A Saturday morning outside Lachute, Quebec, a small town, approximately 60 kilometers northwest of Montreal, sitting in the flat country between the Laurentians and the Ottawa River. The kind of place where Saturday morning highway traffic is light, and the roads through the surrounding countryside carry little beyond locals and farm vehicles and motorcyclists heading south toward the city. The highway outside Lachute is the kind of road that disappears from your memory the moment you leave it. 2 lanes, flat stretches, the occasional farmhouse set back from the shoulder, sky everywhere. On a Saturday morning in April, with the weather turning and the riding season beginning to open up, it would have felt like the first genuinely good morning of the year. The kind of morning that people who ride motorcycles will recognize the specific pleasure of being back on a road after months of winter, the engine, sound, and the air, and the sense that the season, at least, had returned. Phil Boudreault is on his motorcycle. Megan Rose, his girlfriend, is riding with him. They are heading toward a motorcycle show in Laval. It is just past 10 inches the morning. The road is quiet. The morning is ordinary. Then a blue and grey SUV pulls alongside them. Witnesses later counted somewhere between 10 and 15 shots. The vehicle accelerated and disappeared. The shots were not random. They were directed, sustained, and produced by a vehicle with multiple occupants who had prepared for exactly this scenario. The volume of fire reflected planning. The clean exit reflected preparation. Somebody had been watching Phil Boudreaux's routines, had identified a window of vulnerability, and had organized an operation around it. Phil Boudreault went down. During the attack, he had positioned himself to shield Megan Rose. She survived without serious injury. 2 bullets entered Boudreaux's body. They punctured his lung. Shrapnel from the impacts lodged near vertebrae in his spine. Emergency services arrived and transported him to hospital. Doctors placed him in an induced coma while they assessed the extent of the damage. When he came out of it weeks later, he could not walk. The spinal damage was too severe. The wheelchair was not a temporary measure. It became a permanent feature of his life from that April morning forward. The Sûreté du Québec confirmed within hours that the shooting was linked to organized crime. No suspects were publicly named. No arrests were made. The attempted murder of the Vice President of Ontario's most elite Hells Angels chapter on a public highway, in broad daylight, in front of a witness, with between 10 and 15 shots fired from a vehicle that then drove away cleanly, remained officially unsolved. It was the first time someone had attempted to kill a high-ranking Hells Angel at liberty in Quebec since the murder of Normand Hamel, shot dead in a Laval parking lot on the 17th of April 2000. 16 years of relative quiet at the senior level. Then, a Saturday morning outside, a town most Canadians have never heard of, ended that quiet. The attack did not come from a rival organization. It did not come from a street gang or an independent crew or any external enemy. It came from inside the same organization. Not from strangers wearing different patches, from men wearing the same one. Different chapter, same club, same death's head patch. That is the specific and defining horror of the Lachute shooting. Phil Boudreault had spent 30 years inside a world defined by loyalty and the patch and the principle that the men who wore it stood by each other. He had built his identity inside that framework. He had honored it under pressure, through convictions and legal conditions, and every institutional attempt to separate him from it. He had called the most respected man in that world Dad, and meant it. And the thing that put him in a ditch on a Quebec highway was wearing the same patch. The summer that followed, the shooting of Phil Boudreault on the 16th of April 2016 was the first shot of what became, across the summer months, an open and escalating internal war. Weeks after Lachute, a second shooting followed in Granby, Quebec. Same pattern, a target connected to the Ontario nomads, a vehicle, shots fired, no arrests. The Sherbrooke chapter was not treating the Lachute shooting as a resolution. It was a statement of intent, and the statement was being repeated. Then, the 12th of August 2016, Sherbrooke itself, the heart of the rival chapter's own territory, their city, the place from which the entire dispute had originated. Martin Bernatchez, president of the Ontario Nomads and Phil Boudreaux's direct superior, was shot 3 times in the street in Sherbrooke. 3 shots, in the rival chapter's own territory, in daylight. That escalation meant something. The Sherbrooke chapter had shot the vice president of the Ontario Nomads in April. Someone, whether the Nomads directly or individuals acting in their interest, had responded by shooting the Sherbrooke chapter's enemies inside their own city. The retaliatory logic was clear, and the cycle was accelerating. An open internal war between two chapters of the same organization, visible enough that it was generating headlines and police responses, was not something the Hells Angels could sustain without consequences. Police stepped in, as the conflict threatened to spiral beyond anything that could be contained. The Sûreté du Québec launched Operation Mirador, targeting the drug networks at the center of the territorial dispute. High-ranking members of both the Sherbrooke chapter and the Ontario Nomads were swept up in the operation. A lawyer who had reportedly been functioning as a back-channel mediator between the two factions was also arrested. Someone trying to find a negotiated resolution had been drawn into the criminal investigation around the conflict he was trying to stop. Even the attempt to negotiate had not been enough to stop the guns. By August 2016, the Ontario Nomads chapter, based in Ottawa, was formally disbanded. The chapter ceased to exist. The operation that Phil Boudreault had helped build inside Quebec, the years of work during the SharQc vacuum, the relationships and routes and infrastructure the Nomads had established, gone, dissolved. The Sherbrooke chapter had won the territorial dispute through violence, and the organizational response was to remove the chapter that had triggered it. Boudreault was in a wheelchair. Benatchez had 3 bullet holes in him. The chapter was gone, and the people who had shot Phil Boudreault on a Quebec highway in April had never been charged. The disbanding of the Ontario Nomads chapter in August 2016 had an organizational significance that extended beyond the immediate territorial dispute. The Nomads' designation that elite, no territory limit formation at the top of the Hells Angels' internal hierarchy had been Ontario's claim to full organizational parity with the most powerful chapters in the country. Losing that chapter was not just losing territory in Quebec. It was a statement about the balance of power within the Canadian organization, and it was a statement that had been written in gunfire and enforced through institutional decision-making at the club's highest levels. The people who made the decision to disband the chapter knew exactly what they were doing. They were resolving the territorial dispute in favor of Quebec and signaling to Ontario that the resolution was final. In January 2018, the Ontario Nomads chapter in Ottawa was re-established, but under conditions that acknowledged Quebec's victory explicitly. Radio Canada, citing police sources, reported that the chapter had obtained a new charter, but would need to be careful not to encroach on territory controlled by Quebec Hells Angels. They came back smaller, quieter, and with the understanding that the territorial argument they had lost in 2016 was not to be relitigated. The institution had moved on. Phil Boudreault was still in the wheelchair. What survival looks like. Surviving a shooting like Lachute does not mean what people outside that world imagine it means. Phil Boudreault came out of the induced coma. He was alive. He breathed. His heart continued. By the clinical measurement, he had survived. But the man who had trained through injuries, who had torn his Achilles tendon in a professional fight and finished the round, who had carried 2 identities across 2 decades without allowing either one to compromise the other, that man was now navigating the world in a wheelchair, managing chronic pain and recurring infections and wounds that refused to fully close. The damage the bullets had done to his lung and his spine was not temporary. It was cumulative. It compounded. It added to itself over the years in ways that no single procedure could permanently address. The years after the shooting were not quiet ones for his health. Hospitalizations, medical interventions. A body that had once been an elite athletic instrument, adapted through a lifetime of combat training to absorb punishment and continue, now absorbing something it could not overcome by will alone. By October 2025, 9 years after Lachute, nearly a decade of living with what those shots had done, Phil Boudreault had lost a leg, an amputation brought on by complications that traced directly and causally back to the injuries sustained on that April morning in 2016. The man who had stood in an Olympic ring in Atlanta at 20 years old, who had earned a full patch vest in an Amsterdam motel room, who had risen to vice president of the most elite Hells Angels chapter in Ontario, that man was now in a wheelchair, missing a limb, carrying the long and unrelenting physical cost of a highway attack that nobody had ever been charged for. The week before he died, Gord Apolloni sent him a text message. Apolloni had heard that competitive para-boxing had recently been formalized in Canada, a classification system and competitive structure for athletes with physical disabilities. with adapted rules for wheelchair competition. He wanted Boudreault to know. He wanted him to know there was still a ring, if he wanted one. There was still a place for the kid from Top Glove Academy. Whether Boudreault had the chance to seriously consider what that would have looked like, the Sudbury sensation, decades after Atlanta, finding his way back into a ring on different terms, under a different set of conditions, but in a ring no one can say. He died before that possibility could become anything more than a message on a phone screen. But that Apolloni sent it tells you something. He still thought of Boudreault as a fighter. Even at the end, even after everything, he was still the kid who had walked into Top Glove and made everyone around him better. On the 19th of May, 2018, Phil Boudreault married Megan Rose at a small outdoor ceremony in Niagara Falls. The woman who had been on the motorcycle beside him when the SUV pulled up alongside them outside La Chute. The woman who had shielded herself behind him as the shots came. The woman who had launched a GoFundMe in the weeks after the shooting to cover the staggering medical bills that followed. Who had written publicly about his pain and his determination and the slow, grinding difficulty of every day's recovery. She had stayed. Through the coma, through the wheelchair, through everything the years had taken from him physically, she had stayed and become his wife. In a life that had rarely allowed for softness, that ceremony in Niagara Falls was one of the exceptions. Phil Boudreault died on the 20th of January, 2026. He was 3 days short of his 51st birthday. The official cause was health complications stemming from the 2016 shooting. He left behind his wife Megan and his daughter Chanel Rose. The gunman had not finished the job on that April morning outside La Chute. It just took them 10 years to complete it. The question that remains: when Phil Boudreault died, the people who had known him best were careful about what they said publicly. His coach, Gord Apolloni, called him a proud Sudbury son and a boxing icon. He described an incredible fighter and an incredible athlete and said the city had lost someone it should remember. His family said he passed away, surrounded by love. They described a devoted husband to Megan, a fiercely loving father to Chanel Rose, a man who lived loudly and entirely on his own terms. Nobody spoke about the highway. But the highway is where the question lives. It has lived there since the 16th of April, 2016, and it has never been publicly answered by anyone with the authority to answer it. Who gave the order to shoot Phil Boudreault? That question is, in the Hells Angels world, essentially unanswerable through normal channels. The organization's operational principle around internal conflicts is silence, not because its members are incapable of speaking, but because speaking is understood to carry consequences that silence does not. This is not a cultural preference or a tradition carried forward for sentimental reasons. It is functional. It is the thing that makes prosecution difficult and accountability rare. Every member understands this from the moment they begin to move through the club's structure. The silence is not optional. It is the condition on which everything else rests. The investigation has never produced a public arrest. The Sûreté du Québec kept the file open, but the code of silence that protects the Hells Angels from law enforcement held around this case as completely as it holds around every other. Potential witnesses understood the stakes of talking. Associates who might have provided context refused to engage. The case became another entry in a system full of unsolved organized crime files. But the context points in one direction. The shooting happened 5 months after the Sherbrooke chapter made its territorial position explicit. It targeted the vice president, the number 2 man of the chapter that had been encroaching on Sherbrooke's territory. It was professional. A vehicle, multiple shooters, 10 to 15 rounds fired, a clean exit with no shell casings left at the scene, and no witnesses able to describe the occupants with sufficient clarity to support identification. The perpetrators had studied the target, identified a window, and executed an operation. 4 months after Boudreault was shot, the Ontario Nomads president was shot in Sherbrooke, and then the chapter was disbanded. And then, a year and a half later, it was reconstituted under conditions that explicitly acknowledged Quebec's territorial authority. That is the arc of consequence. The shooting of Phil Boudreault was the opening move in a conflict that concluded with his chapter's dissolution and the organization's formal concession of the territory at the center of the dispute. Was it his own club that shot him? Not in the simple institutional sense. The Hells Angels as a unified entity did not formally order its own vice president killed, but factions within the same organization, operating under rival chapter leadership in an inter-chapter territorial dispute that had escalated past politics and into gunfire, yes. The men who drove that blue and grey SUV wore the same patch Phil Boudreault wore. They identified as the same organization. They operated under the same name. They just wore it for a different chapter and concluded that the territorial dispute mattered more than the principle of the patch. That is what the title of this story means. His own club shot him, not outsiders, not enemies in the traditional sense. People who had taken the same oaths, earned the same patch, operated within the same organizational hierarchy, and then decided that a provincial territorial boundary was worth 10 to 15 rounds on a quiet Quebec highway. The code of silence that protected those men afterward was the same code Phil Boudreault had honored for 30 years. He knew it. They knew he knew it. And they were right to count on it. He never cooperated with investigators. He never provided information that could have produced an arrest. He sat in that wheelchair with the knowledge of what had been done to him and who had done it, and maintained the silence that the organization demanded. He built his life on loyalty, and the people who shot him were counting on his loyalty to keep them free. They were right. What he left behind. Phil Boudreault's story does not resolve cleanly. It never could have. The structure of his life did not permit clean resolutions. He was not a straightforward victim, and this was never a straightforward story. He was a man who understood his choices and made them anyway, every time, from the beginning to the end. He was also, by every account from the people who knew him in the boxing world, a genuinely good trainer and mentor. When he came back to Top Glove in later years as a visitor, as someone checking in on the gym that had shaped him, Apolloni said, it felt like he had never left. He worked with younger fighters. He showed them things that you cannot learn from books or YouTube videos or any source other than someone who has actually stood in a ring at the level he had stood at. That was real. That was something he gave to people that they could not have gotten anywhere else. His daughter, Chanel Rose, will grow up knowing that her father was an Olympian, that he stood in an Olympic ring in Atlanta at 20 years old and made people in a northern Ontario mining city pour into the streets to share in something. That every coach who ever worked with him said they had never seen another athlete quite like him, that he was devoted to her mother and to her, and that on a highway outside Lachute, he shielded the woman he loved while someone fired 10 to 15 shots at them, and that Megan Rose walked away because of what he chose to do in that moment. She will also grow up knowing that he was shot on that highway and left in a wheelchair, and that nobody was ever publicly charged for it. That the attack killed him slowly, over 10 years, through amputations and complications and a body that couldn't overcome what those shots had done. That the people responsible are free. Both of those things are true, simultaneously. The Olympian and the outlaw, the hero of the parade and the man in the handcuffs. The vice president of the most elite chapter in the country and the man in the wheelchair. He carried all of it at once, from the very beginning, and he never asked anyone to choose which part to remember. The image that contains all of it is the one from Sudbury in 1996, the Olympic boxer coming home, the floats, the crowds, the cheering still going, and the police officers moving through that crowd toward him, warrant in hand, while the celebration was still happening. The boxer and the biker, side by side, impossible to separate. The triumph and the consequence, arriving at the exact same time. The ring made him, the other life consumed him, and in the end, both of those things were always going to be true at once. The case is unsolved. The file is open. The people who shot Phil Boudreault on a Quebec highway walked free while he lost years and mobility and ultimately his life to what they did. And the specific name, the specific person who gave the order to drive that SUV alongside a motorcycle on a Saturday morning outside Lachute will likely never appear in any courtroom. But in the silence around it, the shape of the truth is visible. It was internal, it was calculated, and it was carried out by men who had complete confidence that the code they were counting on to protect them was one Phil Boudreault would honor until the day he died.